Brittany Eldridge was just 25 years old when her life was taken in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. She was young, full of life, and had so much ahead of her. But what makes this case even more heartbreaking, she wasn't just a young woman with dreams. She was also 8.5 months pregnant. She was just weeks, maybe even days, away from bringing her son Zeke into the world. And then, in a brutal act of violence, both Brittany and her unborn child were murdered. To truly understand the weight of this tragedy, we have to go back and look at who Brittany was. She wasn't just another name in a case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a soon-to-be mother. She worked at an insurance company in Knoxville, Tennessee, and by all accounts she was incredibly hardworking. She wasn't the type to slack off or call out of work unless something was seriously wrong. She had big dreams of being the best mother she could be, even though she knew raising a child on her own wouldn't be easy. And that's the thing. Brittany was going to be a single mom. Her baby's father, Norman Clark, wasn't exactly jumping for joy when she told him she was pregnant. In fact, the guy was already in another relationship at the time. Yeah, imagine that. You're carrying someone's child, and instead of stepping up, they're busy playing house with someone else. But Brittany? She wasn't the type to sit around and feel sorry for herself. She was determined to give her son a good life, with or without Norman's help. She picked out a name, Zeke. She had a baby shower. She had plans for her future, even if she knew things wouldn't be picture perfect. And then, on the night of December 13th, 2011, everything changed. Brittany didn't show up for work the next day. Now, like I said before, she wasn't the type to just not show up. People who knew her immediately felt like something was off. It wasn't like her to go silent. She was in the final stretch of her pregnancy. Any day now, she could have gone into labor. So her mother, Robin Owens, did what any worried mother would do. She went to check on her daughter. She probably hoped that Brittany had just overslept. Maybe she was feeling sick. Maybe, just maybe, she had already gone to the hospital. But when she arrived at Brittany's apartment, what she found was something no parent should ever have to see. Brittany was dead. Her body was discovered in her bedroom, and it was clear that this wasn't an accident. She had been brutally attacked. She had been strangled and stabbed multiple times. And, as if that wasn't horrific enough, her unborn child, little Zeke, didn't survive either. Now, let's take a second to really think about that. Brittany was a woman who had spent months preparing to bring her baby into the world. She had probably felt him kick. She had probably spent nights imagining what his little face would look like. She had already started loving him before he was even born. And in one night, in one act of unimaginable violence, both of their lives were taken. Who could do something like this? Who would be so heartless that they would take the life of a woman on the verge of motherhood and her innocent, unborn child? Well, that's where things start to get even more disturbing, because as police began their investigation, one name immediately stood out: Norman Clark, the baby's father. The man Brittany had been begging to take responsibility. And let me tell you, if this guy seemed shady before, what investigators found next made him look downright guilty. First, there was the fact that Norman's DNA was found at the crime scene. That alone? Not great. Then there were the text messages Brittany had sent him the night before. Messages where she was practically pleading with him to step up, to be a father. But Norman, he had everything to lose if Brittany had that baby, because remember, he was still involved with another woman. He had another life outside of Brittany and Zeke, a baby. That would have been a huge problem for him. And then, there were his Google searches. Oh yeah, this dude was out here looking up ways to kill someone without getting caught. You can't make this up. Now, with all of this evidence, you'd think this case would be open and shut, right? Brittany and her baby are dead. The father of the child has every reason to want them gone. His DNA is at the crime scene. He has no solid alibi, but somehow, to this day, no one has been convicted for Brittany's murder. Her family never got justice. Her baby boy never got to take his first breath. And Norman, well, he's a free man. And that's the part that makes this whole thing so infuriating. Because Brittany Eldridge was a 25-year-old woman who should have had her whole life ahead of her. She should have been holding her baby in the hospital, rocking him to sleep, watching him grow up. Instead, her life was stolen from her in the most brutal way possible. And the person who may have done it, he walked away. So I have to ask, how does something like this happen? How does a pregnant woman get murdered in cold blood, and yet no one is held responsible? Let me know what you guys think, because honestly, this case, it's one of the most infuriating I've ever come across. It was December 2011, just weeks before Christmas, when everything took a tragic and horrifying turn. Brittany Eldridge was found dead in her Knoxville apartment, and the circumstances surrounding her death were beyond brutal. Let me paint the picture for you. Brittany was 8.5 months pregnant. She was in the final stretch, just days or weeks away from meeting her baby boy, Zeke. She had spent months preparing, imagining his tiny hands, his little cries, his first moments in the world. But instead of celebrating a new life, Britton's family was about to be faced with an unspeakable nightmare. It all started when Britton didn't show up for work. Now, this wasn't like her. She wasn't someone who would just disappear or ghost her responsibilities. If she wasn't going to make it, she would have called or texted. But that day, nothing. Silence. Her mother, Robin Owens, began to worry. At first, maybe she thought Brittany was sick. Maybe she had gone into labor. Maybe she was just resting. But deep down, Robin felt something was wrong. A mother's intuition, you know. So she decided to check on her. She arrived at Brittany's apartment, hoping, praying that everything was fine. Maybe Brittany was just sleeping. Maybe she had forgotten to set her alarm. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. But as soon as she stepped inside, that hope shattered into a million pieces. The apartment was eerily silent. Too quiet. No sign of Brittany moving around. No sound of the TV. No rustling of papers. Nothing. Just stillness. And then she saw it. Brittany was there, in her bedroom, but she wasn't breathing, she wasn't moving, she was gone. Her body had been brutally attacked. It was clear, this wasn't natural, this wasn't accidental, someone had done this to her. She had been strangled, a slow, intimate, violent act. Someone had wrapped their hands, or maybe even an object, around her throat and squeezed the life out of her. Imagine that. The sheer force, the rage, the lack of mercy. Someone had looked her in the face as she gasped for air, as she fought for her life. And they didn't stop. And as if that wasn't horrific enough, she had also been stabbed multiple times. Strangulation alone is already an extremely personal way to kill someone, but to then stab her? That suggests something deeper, a crime of passion, hatred, anger, a need to make sure she was dead. And let's not forget, she wasn't just Brittany, she was also carrying a baby, baby Zeke. He was almost here, almost ready to take his first breath, almost ready to live. But he never got the chance. Whoever did this didn't just kill Brittany, they killed her unborn child too. The scene itself was horrific. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, which meant Brittany probably knew her killer. She had let them in. Maybe she trusted them. Maybe she didn't think, even for a second, that they were capable of something this monstrous. And the worst part? Her family had to see her like that. Can you even imagine? Walking into your child's home and finding them murdered, realizing in that moment that your daughter is gone, that your grandson is gone. that their lives were stolen in the most cold-blooded way possible. Robin Owens, Brittany's mom, later described it as the worst moment of her life. And honestly, how could it not be? No mother should ever have to bury their child, let alone find them murdered in their own home. And right away, the question became, who would do this? Who would be so heartless, so cruel, so full of rage that they would take the life of a pregnant woman? When police arrived, they took in the crime scene, and one thing was clear: this wasn't random. This was personal. Brittany wasn't the victim of a break-in gone wrong. There weren't signs of robbery, no valuables missing. The attack itself, too brutal, too emotional. This wasn't just about hurting her. This was about sending a message. This was about making sure she was dead. And that's when investigators started to focus on the one person who had the most to lose if Brittany had that baby. Norman Clark. Because let's be honest, who else had a motive? Brittany was so close to giving birth. She had been texting Norman, telling him she needed him to be a father, to take responsibility. And Norman? Well, let's just say he wasn't thrilled about the idea. He had another woman in his life, another relationship, a baby with Brittany. That would complicate everything for him. So the timing of it all? Suspicious as hell. And let's not forget, when police examined the crime scene, they found DNA evidence that linked back to Norman. His DNA was there. And yet, somehow, he has never been convicted. So let's sit with that for a second. A pregnant woman was strangled and stabbed to death in her own home. The father of her child had a clear motive, was texting her the night before, had his DNA at the crime scene, and had searched online for ways to kill someone without getting caught. And somehow, today, he's a free man. Brittany and Zeke's deaths remain unsolved, unpunished, and that is absolutely infuriating. So, I have to ask, how does something like this happen? How does a pregnant woman get murdered in cold blood, and yet the person most likely responsible walks away free? If this case doesn't make your blood boil, I don't know what will. Brittany Eldridge wasn't just a murder victim, she was a mother-to-be. She had spent nearly 9 months carrying her baby boy Zeke, feeling him move inside her, preparing to bring him into the world. She had picked out his name, imagined his tiny hands, his soft cries, his first moments of life. She had dreams for him, dreams of watching him grow, of holding him in her arms, of giving him the best life she could. But none of that would happen, because on that fateful night in December 2011, Zeke's life was stolen, before he ever got the chance to take his first breath. Imagine that for a moment, a baby, so close to being born that Brittany could have gone into labor any day now, taken from this world before he even got to see it, before he got to meet his mother, before he got to feel her arms around him, before he got to experience even a second of life. The brutality of Brittany's murder wasn't just about her. It was also about Zeke, because when her killer strangled and stabbed her, they weren't just killing a young woman, they were also killing her child. Her body was supposed to be his safe place, the place where he was growing, where he was nurtured, where he was protected. But instead it became his tomb. And what makes it even more tragic is that Zeke was perfectly healthy. If Brittany had made it just a little longer, just days or even hours longer, he could have been delivered safely. He was so close to crying for the first time, so close to being held in his mother's arms, but instead he died with her, his life snuffed out before it even had a chance to begin. Think about that. A completely innocent, helpless baby whose only crime was existing was murdered alongside his mother. Whoever did this knew Brittany was pregnant. They knew that by taking her life, they were taking his as well. And they did it anyway, no hesitation, no mercy. Now, here's where it gets even more heartbreaking. When Brittany's body was found, her family wasn't just grieving for her, they were grieving for Zeke too. They weren't just mourning the loss of a daughter, a sister, a friend. They were mourning the loss of a baby they were all ready to meet. A baby who already had a name. A baby who already had a family waiting for him. Brittany's mother, Robin Owens, had been so excited to become a grandmother. She had been counting down the days until she would finally meet her grandson. She had probably imagined holding him in the hospital, rocking him to sleep, spoiling him like grandmothers do. But instead, she was faced with the unimaginable, burying both her daughter and her grandson at the same time. And let's talk about the crime scene for a second. Because this wasn't just an attack, it was a deliberate, cold-blooded murder. Brittany was found in her apartment, her body showing clear signs of struggle. She had fought for her life, fought for her baby, but it wasn't enough. The person who did this had overpowered her, had made sure she didn't survive. And because she was 8.5 months pregnant, she was even more vulnerable. It would have been harder for her to defend herself. Her body was already working overtime to support her baby. She was likely exhausted, and in that moment she was likely thinking not just about herself but about Zeke, desperate to protect him, to survive for him, to make it through this attack so he could be born. But she couldn't. And Zeke, he never even had a chance. It's devastating to think about. A baby that close to birth is not just a pregnancy, he was a fully developed child. He was probably kicking inside of her, moving, alive. But the moment Brittany's killer took her last breath, so did he. Now, in cases like this, you would think the justice system would step in, that Brittany's killer would be charged not just for her murder, but for Zeke's as well. But here's the horrifying part. Because Zeke never took a breath outside of Brittany's body, his death wasn't considered murder under Tennessee law. Yeah. Let that sink in. A baby, fully developed, just days away from being born, was killed in an act of violence, and yet legally, it wasn't treated the same as if he had already been born. The person responsible wasn't charged with 2 murders, just one, as if Zeke's life didn't count, as if he didn't matter. And that is absolutely infuriating. Brittany's family had to bury not just her but her unborn son, knowing that the justice system failed him before he even had a chance to live. And to this day, Zeke's killer, the person who took both of their lives, has never been held accountable. Brittany and Zeke should have been celebrating their first Christmas together. Instead, their family spent that holiday in mourning. Instead of buying baby clothes and setting up a nursery, Brittany's mother was picking out a casket for her daughter and her grandson. And let's not forget who had the most to lose if Zeke was born. His father, Norman Clark. Norman had every reason to want Brittany and Zeke gone. He had been avoiding responsibility since the moment Brittany told him she was pregnant. He was in another relationship. He didn't want his world turned upside down. And suddenly, Brittany and Zeke were both dead. His DNA? At the crime scene. His Google searches? Ways to kill someone without getting caught? His reaction to the pregnancy? Total denial, total avoidance, total rejection. And yet, he was never convicted. Think about that. A pregnant woman was strangled and stabbed to death. Her unborn baby was killed along with her. And the man with the most motive, the most to lose, the most suspicious behavior, walked away free. And to this day, no one has been held responsible for Zeke's death. Brittany should be alive. Zeke should be alive. And yet here we are. No justice, no answers, just a grieving family and a murderer still walking free. So I have to ask, how is this even possible? because if this case doesn't make your blood boil, I don't know what will. When it comes to cases like this, when a pregnant woman is murdered in her own home, the first question detectives always ask is, who had the most to lose? Who had the strongest motive? Who would benefit the most from her death? And in this case, all signs pointed to one person, Norman Clark. Norman wasn't just some random person in Brittany's life. He wasn't just a co-worker or a friend. He was the father of her unborn child, the man who had played a role in bringing baby Zeke into existence, whether he liked it or not. But that's just it, he didn't like it. Norman Clark wanted nothing to do with that baby. See, Brittany and Norman had been seeing each other off and on for a while, but it wasn't serious. At least, not to Norman. To him it was probably just something casual, something that didn't come with responsibilities. But Brittany? She was the one left to deal with the reality of what came next. So when she found out she was pregnant, it wasn't a question of if she was going to have the baby. It was happening. She was going to be a mother. And Norman? He didn't want to be a father. Not to this baby. Not with Brittany. Why? Because he had another woman in his life. That's right. While Brittany was preparing for the arrival of their son, Norman was still involved with someone else. Another woman. Another relationship. A baby with Brittany? That would ruin everything. It would mean child support. It would mean responsibility. It would mean his life getting more complicated than he wanted it to be. It would mean having to answer to two women at once, balancing a messy situation he never wanted to deal with. And Norman? He wasn't interested in stepping up. Brittany had texted him, called him, tried to get him to be a part of their baby's life. She told him she needed his help. She wanted him to be there for their son. But every time she reached out, Norman's response was cold, distant, avoidant. He didn't want to acknowledge it. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want this baby to exist. And then, just weeks before the due date, Brittany is brutally murdered. That's not just a coincidence. That's suspicious as hell. Let's break this down for a second. If Brittany had given birth to Zeke, Norman would have been on the hook financially, legally, emotionally. He wouldn't have been able to ignore it anymore. That baby would have been real. There would be paternity tests, child support orders, obligations. And if his other woman found out, that could have destroyed his entire relationship. But with Brittany gone? With Zeke gone? Problem solved. No baby, no child support, no drama. It's the kind of selfish, cold, calculated motive that makes you sick to your stomach. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Norman wasn't just the main suspect because of his motive. The evidence pointed straight to him, too. First, his DNA was found at the crime scene. Think about that. Norman's DNA was there, in the apartment where Brittany was murdered, in the place where she was strangled and stabbed to death. Now, defenders of Norman might say, well, of course his DNA was there. He had been with Brittany before. Maybe it was left there from a previous visit. But here's the thing. Brittany was violently murdered. She fought for her life. There was a struggle, and Norman's DNA was on her body, not just in the apartment. On her. Now tell me, what are the chances of that happening by accident? And let's talk about Norman's behavior after Brittany's murder. When someone you know, the mother of your child, is killed, most people would be shocked, devastated, heartbroken. They'd want to cooperate with the police. They'd be desperate to find out who did it. They'd want justice. But Norman didn't seem to care. He wasn't pleading for answers. He wasn't heartbroken over the loss of his child. He wasn't acting like a man who just found out that his unborn son had been murdered before he ever got to live. He was cold, emotionless, detached. And then the investigators found something even more chilling. Norman had searched online for ways to kill someone without getting caught. Let me repeat that. The main suspect in Brittany Eldridge's murder had been looking up how to commit murder and get away with it. What are the odds? It doesn't take a detective to put two and two together. A woman is murdered in her home. The father of her child, who had every reason to want her and the baby gone, has his DNA at the scene. He had been avoiding responsibility. He had been cheating, lying, running away from the truth. He had searched for ways to kill someone. And somehow, he's never been convicted. Despite everything, Norman Clark walked free. He was arrested, sure. He was put on trial. But the jury? They couldn't convict him. There wasn't enough hard evidence. Even though his DNA was there, even though his motive was clear as day, even though Brittany and her unborn child were dead, and that is one of the biggest failures of justice I have ever seen. A pregnant woman was murdered. A baby was killed before he ever got to take a breath. And the one person who had the most to gain from their deaths, the person whose DNA was there, the person who had been searching for ways to kill someone, he got away with it. So tell me, how is this justice? How does a woman, 8.5 months pregnant, end up murdered in her own home, and yet the man who had the strongest reason to want her gone is still walking around free today? Because if this case doesn't make your blood boil, I don't know what will. DNA evidence. It's one of the strongest tools in modern forensic science. It can place a suspect at the scene of a crime. It can confirm physical contact. It can even prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone was involved in a murder. And in this case, the brutal murder of Brittany Eldridge and her unborn son Zeke, DNA evidence directly linked Norman Clark to the crime scene. Now, let's really think about this. Brittany was found in her Knoxville apartment, strangled and stabbed in what was clearly a violent and personal attack. This wasn't some random burglary gone wrong. This wasn't a hit-and-run type of crime where the killer just wanted to be in and out. This was up close. This was brutal. This was filled with rage. And somehow, Norman's DNA was there, not just in the apartment, on her body. So ask yourself, how does that happen? How does a man who claimed to have nothing to do with Brittany's murder end up leaving his DNA at the very place she was murdered? Because DNA doesn't lie. Now, Norman and Brittany had been romantically involved at one point, sure. That's not up for debate. So some people might try to explain away the DNA by saying, well, of course his DNA was there. Maybe it was from a previous visit. But let's be real. Brittany was fighting for her life that night. She was strangled. She was stabbed. There was a struggle. This wasn't just some ordinary night at home. So the fact that Norman's DNA was on her body, on her neck, mixed with her blood, means something. Investigators didn't just find his DNA lying on the couch or on an old sweatshirt Brittany might have borrowed weeks ago. They found it in the most crucial places. Think about it. A pregnant woman is strangled to death, and a man who had the most to lose if her baby was born just happens to have his DNA on her neck, the very place where she was choked. That's not coincidence. That's evidence. And yet, despite this, Norman had an explanation. He said that maybe his DNA got there from a past encounter, that maybe it was transferred from something she touched, that maybe, somehow, it was just there without meaning anything. But come on, we're talking about fresh DNA, not something from months ago, not something that could have just been lingering around. And let's not forget, DNA doesn't just magically appear. It doesn't just end up in specific places unless something put it there. And in this case, Norman's DNA wasn't just found in one place. It was found in multiple locations. Investigators also found his DNA under Brittany's fingernails. Now, let's pause for a second. Brittany was strangled and stabbed. This wasn't a quick, clean crime. This was messy, violent, up close. And what do people do when they're being attacked? They fight back. Brittany was 8.5 months pregnant, but that didn't mean she just gave up. She fought. She tried to survive. And in doing so, she likely scratched her attacker, trying to pry him off her, trying to save herself and her baby. And where do we find Norman's DNA? Under her fingernails. You cannot explain that away. That's not casual DNA. That's not DNA that just ended up there by accident. That is DNA that proves a struggle happened. It tells a story of a woman fighting for her life against someone she knew. And Norman Clark was that person. Now, you would think that DNA evidence like this would be enough to seal the case, right? Brittany is murdered. Her baby is killed. The man with the strongest motive just happens to have his DNA at the crime scene, on her body, under her fingernails, mixed with her blood. That should be enough. That should be the smoking gun. But no. Somehow, Norman still walked free. Why? Because even with all of this evidence, the jury couldn't convict him. They said it wasn't enough, that the DNA didn't directly prove he killed her, that even though his DNA was on her body, on her neck, under her nails, they couldn't be certain he was the one who committed the crime. How? How is that possible? How does a man's DNA show up in every key location in a murder case, and yet he's allowed to walk away? Because this is what failure looks like. This is what justice slipping through the cracks looks like. A pregnant woman and her unborn son are dead, and the only person with a clear motive, the only person whose DNA was at the scene, the only person Brittany feared and was trying to get answers from, he walks away. And the worst part? He never once showed remorse, never once acted like a grieving father, never once seemed shocked or devastated by Brittany's death. You would think that, if Norman really was innocent, he would have been the loudest voice demanding justice. He would have been begging the police to find out who did this. He would have been devastated over the loss of his own child. But no. Instead, he was cold, distant, emotionless. Because, deep down, he probably thought he had gotten away with it. And the worst part, he did. Even though the DNA evidence told the truth, the justice system failed to listen. And that is the real tragedy here. Because Brittany Eldridge deserved justice, and so did Zeke. The night before Brittany Eldridge was brutally murdered, she was doing what so many women in her position have had to do, begging the father of her child to step up. She wasn't demanding money. She wasn't asking for the world. She wasn't trying to ruin his life. All she wanted was for Norman Clark to take responsibility for their unborn son, Zeke. And that night, she was texting him, pleading with him, trying to get through to him, trying to get him to see that this wasn't just her baby, this was their baby, a human life, a little boy who was about to be born into this world and who would need his father just as much as he needed his mother. But Norman? He wasn't having it. See, Brittany had been dealing with Norman's avoidance for months. Ever since she told him she was pregnant, he had been distant, not answering her texts, brushing off the reality of the situation, pretending like none of this was happening. It was clear that he wanted nothing to do with this baby. And Brittany knew it. She could feel it every time she reached out to him and got a cold, emotionless response, or no response at all. But she refused to give up. Because this wasn't just about her, it was about Zeke. She knew her son deserved to have a father in his life. She knew that Norman, as much as he might have wanted to avoid it, had a responsibility. Legally, financially, emotionally. So the night before her murder, she tried one last time. She picked up her phone and started texting Norman. Maybe she thought that this time he would finally listen. Maybe she believed that with the baby's due date just weeks away, he would finally realize that this was happening, whether he liked it or not. Maybe she thought she could reason with him, make him see that this was bigger than whatever problems they had between them. But what she didn't know was that, as she was texting Norman, trying to get him to take responsibility, she was sealing her fate. Because Norman didn't want to be a father, not to this baby, not with Brittany. He had another woman in his life. He had a relationship that he was trying to protect, and a baby with Brittany, that would have ruined everything. So when he got those texts, when he saw her words on his screen, words telling him that it was time to step up, that she wasn't going to let him just walk away, that he would have to take responsibility, he snapped. We may never know exactly what was said in those final messages, but we know one thing for sure. By the next morning, Brittany Eldridge was dead. Think about that. A healthy, pregnant woman. A woman who had been preparing for the birth of her son, decorating a nursery, buying baby clothes, getting ready to be a mother, was brutally murdered in her own home, just hours after trying to get Norman to take responsibility. That's not a coincidence. That's not random. That is a direct connection. Brittany wasn't fighting with some unknown enemy. She wasn't wrapped up in a dangerous lifestyle. She didn't have a secret double life that would have put her at risk. The only person who had a reason to want her gone, who had everything to lose if she had that baby, was Norman Clark. And if you think about how this played out, it's chilling. Imagine Brittany sitting alone in her apartment that night, her phone in her hands, waiting for a reply. Imagine her feeling frustrated, maybe even angry that Norman wasn't taking this seriously. Imagine her looking down at her belly, at her son, the baby she was just weeks away from bringing into the world, and wondering how she was going to do this alone. And then, imagine Norman reading those messages, feeling trapped, feeling like the walls were closing in on him, because once that baby was born, everything changed. There would be proof. There would be DNA tests, child support orders, legal obligations. There would be no more running away, and for Norman, that was unacceptable. Maybe he sat there for a while thinking about it. Maybe he tried to convince himself that Brittany was just bluffing, that she wouldn't go through with making him take responsibility, or maybe he knew exactly what he was going to do. Because by the next morning, Brittany wasn't just dead, she was strangled and stabbed. This wasn't just a murder, this was a rage killing. Someone didn't just want Brittany gone, they wanted to make her suffer. And that fits perfectly with Norman's state of mind that night, because if Brittany had just let him go, if she had just accepted that he wanted nothing to do with the baby and moved on, she would probably still be alive, but she didn't. She pushed, she fought for what was right, she stood up for her son, and because of that she paid the ultimate price. It's horrifying to think about. A woman, 8.5 months pregnant, spends her last night alive begging the father of her child to do the right thing. And by morning, she's gone. Her unborn son, gone. And the man who had the most to lose, the man who had every reason to want her and that baby out of the picture, the man she was texting just hours before she died, he walked free, because even with all of this, the motive, the DNA, the suspicious timing, the jury refused to convict him. And that's the kind of injustice that makes your stomach turn. Brittany Eldridge should be here today. She should be raising her son, watching him take his first steps, celebrating his birthdays, but instead, she spent her last hours trying to convince a man to be a father. And he responded by taking everything away from her. And if that doesn't make you furious, I don't know what will. Let's talk about Google searches for a second. In today's world, we Google everything. How to cook a recipe, the name of that one actor from a movie we forgot, directions to a new restaurant. But sometimes Google searches can reveal something much darker, and in the case of Brittany Eldridge's murder, Norman Clark's search history was downright disturbing. Because before Brittany was found strangled and stabbed in her Knoxville apartment, before her unborn baby boy Zeke was killed along with her, Norman was sitting at a computer, typing in some very suspicious questions. Questions about murder. Questions about how to get away with it. Questions that, when you put them in context with everything else, the motive, the DNA, the timeline, make it nearly impossible to believe that this was anyone but Norman Clark. Now, we don't have access to every single thing Norman searched for, but we do know that investigators uncovered highly incriminating online activity leading up to Brittany's murder. And let's be real, when someone is accused of a crime and police find out that, before the crime even happened, that person was Googling things like how to strangle someone, how to kill without leaving evidence, or how to make a murder look like an accident, that's not just suspicious, that's damning. Because what are the chances? What are the chances that a man who just happens to be the last person Brittany was texting before she died, who just happens to have a massive motive for wanting her gone, who just happens to have his DNA all over her body, what are the chances that this same man just happened to be Googling things related to murder before she was killed? The answer? 0. Because Norman wasn't just some random guy doing casual research. He wasn't an aspiring crime writer studying for his next novel. He was a man with something to lose. A man who was backed into a corner. A man who knew that Brittany was not going to let him walk away from his responsibilities. A man who, instead of stepping up and doing the right thing, started researching ways to make sure Brittany and their unborn child were no longer a problem. That's not paranoia, that's premeditation. And premeditation is the difference between a crime of passion and cold-blooded murder. Think about it. If Brittany had been killed in the heat of the moment, maybe in an argument, maybe in a split-second fit of rage, that would be one thing. It wouldn't make it any less tragic, but it would at least mean that Norman hadn't planned to kill her ahead of time. But this was different, because you don't just accidentally Google things about murder before someone in your life ends up dead. You don't just casually research how to commit a crime and then, days or weeks later, find yourself at the center of a homicide investigation. Unless, of course, you were planning it all along. And let's not forget, these weren't just random searches. These weren't general, open-ended questions like, how many murders happen in the US every year? Or, what's the difference between manslaughter and homicide? No. These were specific searches. Searches that lined up almost exactly with the way Brittany was killed, strangulation, stabbing, leaving as little forensic evidence as possible. That's not a coincidence. That's a blueprint for murder. And the fact that Norman just happened to look these things up before Brittany was killed, that should have been game over. That should have been enough. Because at this point, we're not just talking about one piece of evidence. We're talking about a pattern that shows intent, a pattern that shows premeditation, a pattern that, when put together, makes it painfully clear that Norman Clark was guilty. But somehow, even with all of this, the motive, the DNA, the suspicious behavior, the Google searches, Norman still walked free, and that is one of the most infuriating parts of this entire case. Because if this isn't enough to prove guilt, then what is? What more do you need? If a man's DNA is on the victim, if he has a clear and obvious reason for wanting her dead, if he was the last person she was pleading with the night before her murder, and if he was Googling ways to commit a murder before she died, how does he get to walk out of a courtroom a free man. This isn't just one red flag. This is a giant neon sign flashing guilty in big, bold letters. And yet, it wasn't enough. Norman Clark was able to stand in court, listen to all of this evidence being laid out in front of him, and then walk away. He was given a second chance at life, something Brittany and Zeke never got. And that is sickening. Because let's be real, if the roles were reversed, if Brittany had been the one Googling murder methods before Norman turned up dead, you can bet that she wouldn't have gotten the same benefit of the doubt. She would have been convicted instantly. No jury would have hesitated. No defense attorney would have been able to spin it. She would have been locked away for life, and everyone would have agreed that it was the right call. But because Norman was the father, because he knew how to play the system, because the prosecution couldn't give the jury a perfect, cinematic, step-by-step timeline of exactly what happened, he walked free. And that is why this case still haunts people to this day, because when you look at all the pieces, when you put the puzzle together, when you see the motive, the DNA, the Google searches, the lack of an alibi, the complete lack of emotion or remorse, there is only one conclusion. Norman Clark got away with murder. It took 3 years for an arrest to happen. 3 long years of Brittany Eldridge's family waiting, wondering, and hoping that justice would finally come. 3 years of a brutal, senseless double murder. Because let's not forget, this wasn't just about Brittany. This was also about Zeke, her unborn son, who never got to take his first breath. And yet for those 3 years, Norman Clark was walking free. While Brittany's mother, Robin, was grieving the loss of her daughter and the grandson she never got to meet, Norman was out in the world, living his life. He was going to work, dating, socializing, carrying on like nothing had happened. But the thing is, even though he wasn't arrested right away, he was never really free. Because investigators were watching. They weren't going to let this case go. They knew what the evidence pointed to. And finally, in 2014, they made their move. Norman Clark was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, 1 for Brittany and 1 for Zeke. Now, let's put this moment into perspective. For years, Norman had been able to act like he was just an innocent man, like he had nothing to do with this, like he was just another person devastated by Brittany's death. But when police finally put the cuffs on him, that was the moment where all the pretending stopped. Because in the eyes of the law, he was now the prime suspect. The case against him had been building for years. There was DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene. There were the suspicious Google searches. There was the clear motive. A man who didn't want a baby, who wanted to keep his double life intact, who had everything to lose if Brittany had Zeke. And most importantly, there was the fact that he was the last person she was trying to reason with before she was brutally murdered. It was all coming together. And let's be clear, this wasn't just a random arrest. This wasn't police taking a shot in the dark, hoping they had the right guy. This was a case that had been carefully investigated. They weren't going to make this move unless they were sure. So when they finally charged him, when they finally said, "Norman Clark, you are under arrest for the murder of Brittany Eldridge and your unborn son Zeke," that should have been the beginning of justice finally being served. But the problem? An arrest is not a conviction. And even though they had the suspect in custody, even though they had all of this evidence, even though Brittany's family could finally breathe for a second, knowing that he wasn't just out there living his life, it still wasn't over. Because next came the trial. And that's where things took a turn that no one expected. After years of waiting, after Brittany Eldridge's family endured the pain of knowing her killer was walking free, after investigators worked relentlessly to piece together the case, it all came down to the trial. Norman Clark was finally in a courtroom in 2018, facing the charges of 2 counts of murder, one for Brittany and one for her unborn son Zeke. This was supposed to be it. This was supposed to be the moment where justice was finally served, where the evidence would be laid out in front of a jury, and where Brittany's family could finally hear the words guilty and begin to heal. Because let's be honest, the case against Norman was strong. There was the DNA evidence. There were the suspicious Google searches leading up to Brittany's murder. There was the clear motive, a man desperate to escape the responsibility of fatherhood, who had another woman in his life, who stood to lose everything if Brittany had that baby. There was the timing. The fact that Brittany was murdered just hours after texting Norman, urging him to take responsibility for their child. There was the crime itself, a brutal, violent attack. Not a robbery, not a random act of violence, but an act of rage. An act that suggested someone had a deep, personal anger toward Brittany. And yet, when the trial finally played out in 2018, something happened that no one was prepared for. It didn't end with a conviction. It didn't end with Norman being led away in handcuffs to spend the rest of his life in prison. It ended in a mistrial. The jury couldn't agree. Let that sink in. Even with all of this evidence, even with all of these red flags, even with the fact that Norman had every reason to want Brittany out of the picture, the jury couldn't make a decision. That must have been devastating for Brittany's family, to sit in that courtroom, to listen to the case being presented, to know in their hearts that Norman was responsible. And then to hear that, after all of this, after years of waiting, after years of believing this moment would bring justice, the jury was deadlocked. No conviction, no closure, and worst of all, it meant that Norman walked out of that courtroom a free man. Now, let's be clear, a mistrial doesn't mean not guilty. It doesn't mean he was exonerated. It simply means that the jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision. And for the prosecution, that wasn't the end. Because Brittany's family wasn't about to let Norman just walk away without a fight. So prosecutors prepared for round 2. The state made it clear they were going to retry Norman Clark, because they still believed they had a strong case. They still believed that the evidence pointed to only one person, and most importantly, they still believed that Brittany and Zeke deserved justice. So, in 2021, 3 years after the first trial ended in a mistrial, Norman Clark was back in court. And this time, there was even more pressure, because by now people had been waiting a decade for justice. Brittany's mother, Robin, had spent 10 years fighting to see her daughter's killer held accountable. This retrial was supposed to be the moment where the mistakes of 2018 were corrected, where the jury would finally see the truth, where Norman Clark would finally pay for what he did. But then, it happened again. Another trial, another presentation of evidence, another jury, and once again, no conviction. Think about that. This wasn't just one mistrial, it happened twice, after 2 separate trials, 2 different juries, 2 chances to finally put Norman Clark behind bars. He walked free both times. It's beyond frustrating. It's beyond heartbreaking. Because when you look at everything, the motive, the DNA, the timeline, the suspicious online searches, the fact that he was the last person Brittany was trying to hold accountable before she was killed, how could this not be enough? What more do you need? Brittany's family had to sit through another trial, reliving the worst moments of their lives, watching as the case was laid out all over again, only to hear the devastating news that once again, it wasn't enough for a conviction. And just like that, Norman Clark walked away free again. No prison sentence, no consequences, nothing. To this day, no one else has been charged with Brittany Eldridge's murder. Because why would there be? There is no other suspect. The state believed Norman was guilty. Investigators believed Norman was guilty. Brittany's family believed Norman was guilty. And yet, because of 2 failed trials, because of 2 juries that just couldn't come to an agreement, this case remains technically unsolved. And that is a failure of the justice system. Because let's be real, if the roles were reversed, if it was Brittany on trial for Norman's murder, if it was her DNA at the scene, if she had been caught making suspicious Google searches about how to kill someone and get away with it, she wouldn't have walked out of that courtroom once, let alone twice. But Norman Clark, and the worst part? Even though he was arrested, even though he was put on trial twice, there's nothing stopping him from continuing to live his life as if none of this ever happened. But Brittany Eldridge? She didn't get a second chance. She didn't get to fight for her life in a courtroom. She didn't get to raise her son. She didn't get to watch him take his first steps, hear his first words, celebrate his first birthday, because she and baby Zeke were brutally murdered. And the man who had the strongest motive, the man whose DNA was at the scene, the man who should have been convicted, he walked away twice. And that is why people still talk about this case, because justice wasn't served. And it's terrifying to think that a man can be tried for a double murder twice and still walk free, even when all the evidence points to him. It has been over a decade since Brittany Eldridge was found murdered in her Knoxville apartment, a decade since she was attacked in what should have been the safest place in the world for her, a decade since her unborn son Zeke was robbed of his first breath before he ever had a chance to live, and yet, after all these years, after the arrests, the trials, the evidence, the pain and the waiting, one heartbreaking truth remains: no one has ever been convicted of her murder. Think about that for a moment. A woman who was just weeks away from giving birth was strangled and stabbed in her own home, her body left behind in a crime so brutal that it shocked an entire community. The investigation pointed to one suspect. The evidence stacked up. 2 separate trials were held. Prosecutors fought. Investigators pushed. Brittany's family never stopped seeking justice, and yet, somehow, all of it amounted to nothing. Because today, her case remains officially unsolved. No justice, no accountability, no closure. And the question is, how is that even possible? From the very beginning, this wasn't a case of law enforcement not having a lead. There was no mystery suspect, no unknown attacker lurking in the shadows. This wasn't a crime with no direction. It had a suspect. And yet, 2 trials failed to deliver the only outcome that should have been possible: a conviction. Norman Clark was arrested. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. He stood trial twice, but in both instances the jury couldn't come to a unanimous decision. And in the eyes of the law, that means Norman Clark walked away a free man. No other arrests have ever been made. No new suspect has ever been identified. No one else has ever been officially linked to Brittany's murder. Which raises the question, if not Norman, then who? Who else had a reason to kill Brittany Eldridge? Who else had something to lose if she gave birth to baby Zeke? Who else had DNA on her body? Who else was Googling things about murder in the days leading up to the crime? The reality is, if Norman Clark wasn't responsible for Brittany's murder, then the only logical alternative is that this was a random attack by a complete stranger. But let's be honest, does that really seem likely? Because this wasn't just some act of violence that happened in a dark alley or in the middle of a burglary gone wrong. This wasn't a case of Brittany being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was killed in her own apartment. There was no forced entry, no robbery, no evidence of anyone breaking in. Whoever did this had access to her home. Whoever did this knew her well enough to get close to her. Whoever did this wanted her dead, specifically her. This wasn't random. And yet, because of 2 failed trials, because the prosecution couldn't secure a guilty verdict, because the jury couldn't all agree beyond a reasonable doubt, Norman Clark walks free, and Brittany Eldridge's murder sits in limbo, stuck in that devastating category of unsolved. But let's be real. Unsolved doesn't mean there's no answer. Unsolved just means that the system failed to deliver justice, and that is what makes this case so frustrating. Because Brittany's mother, Robin, has spent years fighting for the truth to be recognized. She has lived every single day knowing that the man who should have been convicted, the man she believes with all her heart is guilty, is still out there, going about his life, while her daughter and grandson are gone forever. She doesn't get to visit Brittany and Zeke. She doesn't get to hear her daughter's voice. She doesn't get to hold her grandson. All she gets is grief, and worse than that, she gets no justice. Because no matter how much she has fought, no matter how much evidence has been presented, no matter how much she and everyone else close to this case believe that Norman Clark should have been convicted, the justice system didn't see it the same way. And now, Brittany Eldridge's murder remains an open wound. Legally, it is still classified as an unsolved homicide. There are no new trials planned, no new arrests, no new leads, which means the case is at a dead end. That's the reality. And that is what makes this case so tragic. Because what does it say when a woman can be murdered, when an unborn child can be murdered, and after years of investigation and 2 separate trials, the killer still walks free? What does it say when DNA evidence, motive, online searches, and suspicious behavior aren't enough to convict someone? What does it say about the system when someone can be arrested, charged, and tried twice, and yet no justice is served? It says that sometimes the system fails. Sometimes, even when everything points to a single person, it still isn't enough. Sometimes, the people who need justice the most never get it, and that is the most chilling part of all. Because if it could happen to Brittany, it could happen to anyone. And if Norman Clark wasn't convicted after 2 trials, then the truth is, he probably never will be. And that means that unless something changes, unless new evidence comes forward, unless the case is reopened, unless Brittany's family finds another way to fight, her case will remain where it is today, unsolved, unanswered.